Hey, buddy, watch this.
Yeah, folks, I don't know what to make of this. Some big changes coming to Battlegrounds. Nightmare Amalgam being removed from the game mode, which has just ridiculous sweeping changes. We're going to talk about that and a handful of other big changes coming to Battlegrounds. Before we do, just want to ask you to drop a sub if you're enjoying these videos. We're going to be diving back into Battlegrounds pretty hard here now that Descent of Dragons has been out a little bit and we've been playing that out. So if you're looking for more Battlegrounds videos, this is a good spot to hang out as we learn more about this new meta with Nightmare Amalgam no longer in the pool, which means so many things are going to change. So every build in Battlegrounds right now that's good, or 99% of them have a big Nightmare Amalgam that's been buffed with Poisonous Divine Shield, often a ton of stats, some Death Rattle tokens, and that's the centerpiece for your build. And importantly, it always gives you a buff target because it's every tribe, mech buffs, beast buffs, whatever it is, you can just dump them onto your Nightmare Amalgam. So this kind of battle cry cycling style works really well because you always have something to hit. There's no waste on any of those battle cries. If you have Brand Bronzebeard as a minion out, it just doubles up. It's even better. So Nightmare Amalgam just fits into every composition as this big star taunt Divine Shield centerpiece. When that goes away, that changes things in a few different directions. So first off, the big taunt Divine Shield thing is far harder to do. That's going to be limited more regularly to mechs, where they force you through one big taunted Divine Shield thing. That has some major implications about how other decks build and putting Poisonous on the second unit so you trade into all these sorts of things. I can't even begin to unpack all of that. There's a lot there alone. That also means essentially that I think tribal builds, things like beasts, for instance, might just get better because if you don't have that really powerful battle cry cycling happening all the time, these other builds start to make a lot more sense. They do things better, or maybe the best version of a given build now is possible because you're not competing against this other thing that's just the jack of all trades. I think this also makes things like Lightfang Enforcer significantly worse. Menagerie style builds are going to be a little bit harder when you don't have this catch-all unit, particularly for the dragon buffs, which now feel really weird with things like Menagerie Magician. There's actually now no dragons except for the Curator token in the game. Speaking of which, maybe this makes the Curator a lot stronger, even though it was already very good, because now Curator has access to the one Amalgam in the game, and that's a lot of power spike over your opponent. So Battlecry cycling gets much harder. I think tribal builds get much better. Positioning changes. Curator gets better. Enormous changes, right? This is completely rethinking how we see Battlegrounds today. I can't even imagine what the game is going to be like. Everything you're going to have to relearn, basically, because you just can't underestimate how significant this change is. You can't overestimate how significant this change is. It's a really, really big one, and we're just going to have to keep an eye on it to see what it all means, but definitely look for a different style of Battlegrounds tomorrow when this actually hits. Tomorrow will be December 19th, depending on when you're watching this video. So that said, it's not the only changes happening here. We've already seen this one. This was actually introduced previously, but didn't make it into patch notes until today. Primal Fin Lookout, of course, back to tier 5. We saw that because Morlocks were dominating. This got bumped back to keep them a little more in check. So not much to say here. We've already seen this one in action. But also Cold Light Seer moving back up to tier 3 from tier 2. And this is a big change because it really does slow down those early Murloc boards. Murlocs were the dominant strategy there for a little while. It was too easy to give them all Poisonous. Start getting Divine Shields on those late in the game. Between King Bagurgle and the previous tier 4 Primal Fin Lookout, things were just going crazy for Murlocs. They didn't have any weak points. This is basically introducing 2 weak points into Murlocs. This makes their early game far less sticky, so they're more likely to lose in those early rounds and have a harder time playing for those late game scenarios because they might just die while trying to get to things like Gentle Megasaur. And then the Primal Fin Lookout, of course, gives them a little bit of a gap where suddenly turn 4 is kind of awkward. You have the Tox Fins, but that's about it. So suddenly bridging from, tier 2 to tier 5, which I would call the 2 power spikes for Murlocs, is a lot harder when you only have the Seer and the Toxfin in there to get things going. Not to mention Nightmare Amalgam was a pretty good Murloc option as well to get them moving in that early to mid game phase with some Divine Shield action right off the bat, or maybe Taunt to protect other Murlocs as well. So Murlocs seem like they're going to be substantially weaker, and that's probably a good thing. Particularly if Nightmare Amalgams go away, they could have been a particularly dominant strategy. So I'm happy to see this change with Cold Light back to tier 3. I hope this doesn't mean Murlocs totally die, but with Amalgam changing, perhaps the tribal, bonus I'm expecting for everything else to get in the absence of Amalgam will also help Murlocs and make them a competitively viable option. So now let's talk about the Beast going from tier 4 to tier 3, a buff here for the Beast, which is really quite cool. There were instances already where I didn't totally hate playing the Beast. It often backfired, giving your opponent that 3/3, but it was just a big stat bomb, and often that could help you win some of those mid-game rounds. I know particularly in higher MMR lobbies when we're contesting for leaderboard spots, so on and so forth, you have to play a really high-tempo style, just get big stats as fast as you can, or people are going to race you down. Getting greedy with your rolls or greedy with your build is a recipe for disaster in those 7,500 to 8K MMR brackets. So the Beast was like kind of serviceable sometimes. You could toss it in and be like, okay, this is a stopgap till I get something good. Now it's going to be even better at that. Being able to get this to tier 3, this is going to dominate some early game boards. And I think this becomes a very viable minion to buy in those kinds of lobbies. Depending on your MMR range, you might not be seeing the same thing. It's hard for me to guess because I don't play at different MMR ranges, but this is probably going to be a sleeper good card at tier 3 just because the stats are so significant. It's very rarely going to die in many of those early boards, which means it's going to take 2 or 3 trades favorably. Never give your opponent that 3/3 and just help you really push some damage in those early game scenarios. And then you can just dump it later when you're done with it. But I like this. It's not necessarily a beast build thing. I think it's just a big stat kind of thing. And that makes this minion kind of okay. Maybe don't look for it, but occasionally when it lines up, you got some gold laying around, you're at 3 gold, this is on board, yeah, you gotta take this one, you gotta play it, it's gonna be pretty good. So next up here, we have Mechanoegg, also getting buffed, going from tier 5 to tier 4. And kind of a similar story here, I think, to the Beast. At tier 5, this always felt very weak to me. It's one of those cards that is not all that good on its own, right? It's an 8/8. Which is fine as a splash kind of minion, similar in a lot of ways to the Beast as a 9/7 with no downside, but not being able to attack is kind of awkward. Sometimes it's dying last, and that can be unfavorable for certain reasons. But more importantly, this really only got good with synergies from, say, Baron Geddon. I didn't even think this was a great, say, Cobalt Guardian support card or a Junkbot support card. But now what this means is you can more readily find this if you, say, stay at tier 4 and then triple into a Baron Geddon. You can start rolling for Mechanoeggs pretty greedily at tier 4 alongside a lot of other powerful Death Rattle options. You maybe don't need to push to tier 5 because a lot of the Death Rattle stuff you want is lower in the game. So say Piloted Sky Golem, for instance, Mechanoegg, so on and so forth. And what that means is I think this gives you those supports for those early Baron Geddons you discover when tripling up to tier 5. Sometimes you don't get a brand, you don't get a Light Fang, you go for Baron Geddon, and now this builds into that package really nicely. So I do think this is a much better slot for this card. It's still going to feel awkward in a lot of builds, and I don't really think it makes the cut in mechs even at tier 4, although it's possible being able to triple it much more easily while staying at a lower tier, which is often somewhat consistent to do in mechs. So all in all, good change, still not a crazy strong card, but gives it a couple more angles to actually see play. And then moving on to the Boogie Monster, going from tier 5 to tier 4. I've been calling for this one for forever. It never felt like a tier 5 card. When you discover this, it felt so bad. It was a card you could splash into your build, where it's okay, I didn't hit a big build around or synergy piece on that tier 5 discover. I'm just going to take the 6/7, put it in for a round, and hope for the best. Now, though, as a tier 4 unit, this is, again, kind of like the Beast. One of those things that's okay, yeah, I'm going to put this in for a round or two, and it's going to be a significant part of my build, and it's probably going to take a couple good trades. Now, it's still probably not a great minion at tier 4. Let's be honest, right? It's still not doing a lot of stuff, but the option to kill, 2 or 3 things, going 2 for 1, 3 for 1, in some of those mid-game scenarios, particularly say you tier up and you, or you triple up and you discover this, and there's 2 other, you get a Toxfin and and an oil module that you can't use. It's like, well, Boogie Monster's not that bad. I'm going to be kind of happy to take this. And that means this will see some occasional boards. Still not a great card. Still not something you should look for, but occasionally to splash on your board, gain a round or two of an advantage over your opponents, play for more tempo style. Absolutely, Boogie Monster tier 4 makes sense there. So weak, but not super weak. And then finally, we have one hero change being introduced here. Bran is swapping out, and Bartendotron is swapping back in. I don't have a lot to say about this. I mean, Bran was a very powerful hero, super easy to play in a lot of ways. So I enjoyed Bran personally. I didn't feel like he was too oppressive to play against either. So I guess I'll probably miss him, particularly because I look a bit like Bran. But Bartendotron's fine to come back. I like that there's a cycle happening. I do think this Bran change is interesting in light of the Amalgam change, which both are sort of battle cry-centric things. So Bran might get a little worse anyway with Amalgam going out, so it feels like this could be needless in a lot of ways, maybe moving something like Rafam out instead, although, these are both fairly new heroes, so neither one feels good to rotate at this point, but I think Blizzard's trying to rotate out really high win rate stuff and bring in things like Bartendotron that are probably feeling a little more fair, and that's fine. I don't have a lot of thoughts on heroes. You don't get to play these every game or anything, so their impact is smaller in the scheme of things than minion changes in many cases. But this is fine. It wouldn't be my choice, but it's certainly okay. And will lower the power levels of lobbies to some extent, making weaker heroes feel better, which is fairly nice, I guess. And there you go, folks. Those are the changes. I just do not know what to make of this Amalgam change. I really can't process it, and unfortunately, I'm going to be moving tomorrow, so I will not be able to play Battlegrounds to see this in action for a day. I'm going to be coming in a day late, so I guess you guys can report back to me how this feels or what you think about this one over the next day or two. That said, I hope you enjoyed these thoughts on the Battlegrounds changes. Again, we'll be playing a lot more Battlegrounds soon to see this stuff in action, and just because Descent of Dragons is waning a little bit in its interest. But that said, I hope you will drop a subscription on this video to get more news like this, but also just more gameplay as well. But until then, thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.
Dragons take flight above the ice and snow, high in the sky.